Okay, well, good evening. Welcome to those of you who are here with us in person, and also welcome to those of you who are joining us on the live stream. Welcome to our Maven pre-conference event. This is our event that is kicking off our weekend here in Southern California for the Maven conference. And if you haven't registered for the conference, you can show up tomorrow night when we kick it off. We still have seats available and room here for you. So
How many are coming? Like 400, right?
I think so. I think we have about 400 registered so far. So, yeah, please join us for the whole weekend. But tonight is our pre-conference event. So I am Erin Kunkel.
I'm Sarah Stone Street.
And we are co-hosts on the Strong Women podcast that we do through the Colson Center. I also partner with, I'm also with Maven. My husband and I started Maven 4 years ago. So I kind of wear two hats this weekend.
You wear more than two hats, though.
Actually, that's true. I wear a lot of hats. So we have come together as Strong Women Podcast, Colson Center, Maven, and also Them Before Us for a really important topic on the new normal, the consequences of rethinking the family. And I think all of us would agree that we are feeling the weight of the different slogans in our culture that are being tossed around. When Sarah and I were thinking about slogans, we thought about one that is often thrown around, like, love makes a family. What does that mean? Love makes a family. And then what does that do to our idea of the family if it's just made of love? And also that children just need loving parents. That's all that they need. So it doesn't matter if they're same-sex parents or just co-parenting parents. Co-parenting, that's a new slogan in the culture. And actually just this week, CNN commentator Van Jones announced that his daughter was born through a friend that they agreed to co-parent together. And they plan to stay friends, to live apart, but to share this child. And his quote was this, when they asked about his decision to enter into a co-parenting relationship, he said this. He said, "So we decided to join forces and become conscious co-parents. It's a concept that I hope will move people to explore and consider." So he's not just saying, hey, this is what we decided to do. He's actually hoping that this spurs on more of us to try this new idea of co-parenting. And of course, one of the other lies Sarah and I came up with too is that the kids will be fine. Whatever we adults do, the kids are going to be fine. They're resilient. They're bounce back.
Yeah, and as we were thinking about this topic, if you think about this, in our culture, the common and the most widely spread narrative right now is that we can construct whatever we want, whatever makes us happy, whatever organization of family that we want to call family, we can just construct it. And the same is true with identity and gender and all of this stuff. But if you step back and think about this for a minute, it's really the difference between recognizing that we have a creator and our identity and family is not created by us. It's not a construction that we can just come up with. It's already been designed. And so if you come at it, like if there's not a creator, then it actually makes a lot of sense. Love is love. You know, children will be fine. Like the family can be whatever we want it to be, because if there's nobody designing it, well, then that makes sense. And actually, some of these lies have seeped into the church because, as you all know, when we're swimming in cultural waters, the narrative gets adopted because that's what we're swimming in, right? And so we want to take this night and step back. As T.S. Eliot said, before you know what to do with something, you need to ask, what is this for? And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like sometimes I get in a conversation with someone that's coming from a different perspective on this and that has totally drank this Kool-Aid of, you know, constructing their own identity or constructing their own family. And I'm kind of frozen. Do you guys feel that? Like you're just kind of frozen? I don't know what direction to go with. I don't know how to approach this conversation. And so that's one thing we're prayerful about in this conversation tonight, is that this will be an opportunity for us as Christians and you all watching online to just take out this topic. Let's lay it on the table and say, first of all, what's the big picture? Why is this important, and how can we talk about this in a thoughtful and winsome way? And so that's kind of our hope for the evening.
Yeah. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what's ahead. So we have 3 different speakers tonight, so we're going to hear about 3 different specific topics underneath this big picture, and then we're going to do a Q&A time with all the speakers, and Sarah and I will join them up here, and we'll do some Q&A and interaction with the talks that they've given. So first, we're going to start with, we're going to hear from Brett Kunkel, who I know pretty well, on the topic of developing a Christian worldview. So we're going to start with the big topic of worldview.
Wait, did you tell the live stream audience that that's your husband?
Oh, yeah, it's my husband.
Okay.
I was going to get that,
They
but
may
I
not
should
know
be
that.
clear.
Yeah.
Okay, so Brett is the founder and president of Maven, which he started with his lovely wife, Erin, 4 years ago.
The better half.
The way better.
Way better.
If we do say so ourselves. He is fluent in sarcasm and still loves living in California, surprisingly, despite the mass exodus from the state by most of our friends.
Which you should exit, I think.
I know.
Mean, sorry,
well,
California
Sarah's from
people,
Colorado.
Don't you think? Oh, they're saying no. Okay. Okay, sorry.
Okay, and then our next speaker will be...
Yeah, next speaker is my husband, John Stonestreet, also fluent in sarcasm. And I'm also his lovely wife. But John is going to talk to us about that question that I was just mentioning with T.S. Eliot. We're going to step back. What is marriage for? Big picture. He's not going to tell you how to do marriage, because we are both very much learning how to do marriage after 19 years, growing and loving each other better each year. And so we're not doing that. He's not doing the how-to, but kind of the big picture. And John and I live in Colorado, and we have 4 kids that are here. That's the mini one right there. Hunter, wave to everybody. There he is. He's famous. And then I've got daughters spread out. Abigail's back there. And anyway, so we have 4 kids.
Okay, and then our last speaker is Katie Faust, and she's going to talk to us about the new family and what's happening in the culture and how we can think about it. So Katie, if you don't know her, you are in for a treat. She is the founder and director of Them Before Us, which is made up of ordinary adults who are committed to putting the needs of children at the forefront of the battle surrounding the very foundation of our society, marriage and family. She is a heroic voice in the fight to defend children and their most basic rights in a culture that has a disordered view of their needs and the value of children. She is married to her husband, Ryan, and they've been married 23 years, and they have 4 kids as well. And then, as I say, we will bring everybody up and do questions. So we're going to give you the number to text in for questions. So live stream listeners and audience, get a pin out, and we're going to give you the number to text in questions. And actually, at the end of the night, we're going to give away some books from our speakers, and we're going to choose from people who sent in questions. So that's a motivator right there. Okay.
And if you don't have questions, then Aaron and I will just keep talking and asking all of our questions. So there's motivation too.
Okay, so the number to text your questions, ready, is 626-869-8525. 626-869-8525. Okay, without further ado, our first speaker, Brett Kunkel.
I was getting a little concerned with that introduction there. I was thinking the Stone Streets and the Kunkles are probably going to need some marital counseling if that intro goes too much further. Hey, glad that you're here tonight. What I want to do is kind of frame our conversation tonight. In particular, looking at this issue of family. Now, in 2016, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that there was a requirement for all states to issue same-sex marriage license, right? Well, 2 years prior to that decision, conservative columnist Rod Dreher wrote an article called Sex After Christianity. And I would encourage you to do a search for that article. It's entitled Sex After Christianity, Rod Dreher. Read that article because Rod touches on something before this decision went down that really gets to the heart of what is at issue when it comes to things like same-sex marriage. And this is what Rod said in that article. He said, gay marriage is not just a social revolution, but a cosmological one. Too many Christians think that same-sex marriage is merely a question of sexual ethics. They fail to see that gay marriage and the concomitant collapse of marriage among poor and working-class heterosexuals makes perfect sense given the autonomous individualism sacralized by modernity and embraced by contemporary culture, indeed by many who call themselves Christians. They are fighting the culture war moralistically, not cosmologically. They have not only lost the culture, but unless they understand the nature of the fight and change their strategy to fight cosmologically, within a few generations, they may also lose their religion. So what is Dreher saying here? He's saying this is not merely a moral issue. This is not merely an ethical issue. It runs deeper. It's a cosmological one. What does he mean? Well, he's really getting at this idea that this is a worldview issue. The issue of same-sex marriage and the larger issue of family and marriage that we're going to talk about tonight these are worldview issues. And what we need to do in the church as followers of Christ is to be able to think about these things worldviewishly. All right, now what do we mean by a worldview? A worldview is simply our story of reality, right? Or our picture of reality. What that means is that Christianity, it's not just a story that's a kind of a nice bedtime story that we like to tell and pass along. No, this is actually a true story, or I think maybe a more accurate way to describe it is that it's an account of reality. Christianity is a worldview, and a worldview is an account of reality. It's an account of the nature of reality. Now, what does a worldview do for us? Well, I want you to imagine maybe the typical American mind. All right, and in the typical American mind, we hold all sorts of different beliefs and ideas. And I want you to imagine that each belief and idea that you hold is represented as a kind of a puzzle piece, okay? And so if you were to dump out the contents of the mind of the typical American out onto a table, and the beliefs were puzzle pieces, most American minds would look something like this, wouldn't they? Kind of a scattered, disconnected, jumbled mess of different beliefs. And when we think worldviewishly, what a worldview can help do is it can help take and bring coherence to all of those puzzle pieces. It takes those beliefs and attempts to fit them together, right? And as you put together puzzle pieces, they eventually will begin to form a coherent whole, right? That's what a worldview does for us. It begins to put together a coherent picture of reality. Now, think about this puzzle analogy. Imagine you're doing a puzzle. What are two things that can happen if you're putting together a puzzle that can really derail your little time of putting together that puzzle? Right? Number one, if you have missing pieces. So if you are missing pieces, you get down to the last couple pieces and you realize, you put them in place and you realize, I'm missing 2 or 3 or 4 pieces. That is absolutely frustrating, isn't it? And it doesn't give you that full picture. In the same way, by thinking worldviewishly, what it can help reveal, number one, is whether or not we've got some missing pieces. We've got some missing pieces in our account of reality. But then what's the second thing that can happen that can derail your puzzle? if you have pieces from a different puzzle, right? So you've got another piece. And of course, if you have young kids who have done puzzles and then you've trusted your kids to put away those puzzles, what ends up happening is the next time you get that out, you've got other pieces from other puzzles in there. And that can be frustrating when you're trying to fit this piece that doesn't actually fit in that piece of the puzzle or in that puzzle. In the same way, thinking worldviewishly can help us identify pieces in our puzzle that don't actually fit. Right? Have you ever maybe engaged with a Christian friend on a particular issue, and you were kind of surprised by the fact that they affirmed a position you felt or you thought was not a biblical view? Right? They had a puzzle piece that didn't fit in the Christian puzzle, in the Christian worldview. Okay, now, with a puzzle, think about it. When you dump all those pieces out and you want to start to organize that puzzle, where do you start in a puzzle? You start with the corners, don't you? You start with the edges. Now, why do you do that? Because when you start to put together the edges and the corners, what that will do is it will create a frame that will then make sense of all of the other pieces that you're going to put into that puzzle. And when you have that frame, it makes it easier to start putting those other pieces in. Right? Imagine identifying like a piece of the puzzle that was in the center, and then you started with a center piece and then tried to build your way out. How much more difficult would that be, if not impossible? And throughout that process, you'd probably be putting, wrong pieces together. But we start by framing the puzzle, don't we? Well, in the same way, that's what a worldview can do, and particularly the Christian worldview. We often go running to these different issues, right? And so whether they are issues of sexuality or education or work or social issues, technology, morality, parenting, you name it. We often will say, well, how do I approach this issue? Or what's the right thing to think about, when it comes to this issue? And we will approach those issues as individual puzzle pieces. And no wonder so many Christians struggle to deal with all that we have to deal with in the culture. Right? Because often we're dealing with those pieces in isolation from the larger framework. And so what we need to do is we need to think carefully about the larger framework. And in particular, that framework is made up of very significant questions. And I just want to quickly identify 5 of those significant questions. In fact, John and I outline these questions in our book, A Practical Guide to Culture, right? These questions will frame every puzzle piece that we encounter. What are those questions? It's the question of, number 1, origin, right? A worldview, if it's going to give us an adequate account of the nature of reality, it's going to have to answer this question. Where do we come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? Not only do you have origin, but then you have identity, right? What does it mean to be human? Who am I? What am I? And think about where our culture is at on this one. We can't even answer what it means to be human. We can't even answer what it means to be male or female. And of course, if you don't know what it means to be human, then you certainly can't get human flourishing correct, can you? And we see the results. And now notice there's a flow from origin into identity. How you answer the origin question will largely shape how you answer that identity question. Not only do we have the identity question, we have the question of meaning. Why am I here? What is the purpose of all this? Is there a purpose to all this? Is there something that's some kind of transcendent meaning, or is this just something I build into my own life based upon my own desires or my own preferences? There's the question of morality, right? How should I live my life? In fact, our culture even questions the whole notion of a should, right? And then lastly, destiny. Okay, when this short life is over, what happens? when I die? Is there a part of me that survives the death of my body? Or is the story over at that point? And so notice those 5 questions create a larger framework by which we can make sense of all of the particular puzzle pieces. And so we're looking at tonight this puzzle piece of family, right? And so we're going to see different offerings from the culture, different things that the culture is going to say about the nature of this puzzle piece. And so, for instance, the things that we're going to highlight tonight are not just things that are somehow on the fringe. The radical revisioning of the family is not just something that's on the fringe. What we see is this is gone mainstream. In fact, I'm going to show you a little video clip, about a minute video clip from a video of a children's program called Blue's Clues. How many of you are familiar with Blue's Clues? Right? Blue's Clues is mainstream. And what is the age demographic that the creators of Blue's Clues are after? They're after kind of 2 to 5-year-olds. And this past last year, during the summer, during Pride Month, they put out this video to help us understand that family really can be anything we want it to be.
Hey, Blue, look at all these families. Hi, families. It's time for a pride parade.
Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 mommies, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 daddies, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Come on, friends! Families marching 3 by 3, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 3 by 3, hurrah, hurrah. These Babas are non-binary, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade.
Okay, that video actually counts all the way to 10, so you're welcome that we cut that a little short. But you get a picture, right? What's being offered here for that 2 to 5-year-old audience? A vision of the family. Here's what the family can be. It can actually be, it can be anything you want it to be. Right? This puzzle piece, you get to create that puzzle piece. And there's no larger framework that it fits in. Right? And because in the secular culture, we've actually done away with much of that framework. And so you have something like this. This is just yesterday, Dave Rubin, who considers himself a classical liberal, but many conservatives, those who are political conservatives, consider Dave Rubin an ally, and he is on important issues. But yesterday he tweeted out this picture saying, it's true, all of it. What's true? That he and his same-sex partner are having 2 children. Right now, obviously, as 2 biological males, they're not able to have those children. So how are they having those children? And so there was a host of congratulations from conservative voices on this. What do you have? You have the puzzle piece of family being made however we want to shape it. Now, of course, that's okay if there's no framework, and this is why Christians must think worldviewishly. That puzzle piece. In fact, I think this is one of the most important things we can do for the next generation, is give them that framework, because often we talk to them about these issues in isolation from that larger framework. And when we do that, it loses coherence to a younger generation. It doesn't make sense. Why can't 2 people who love each other and who are consenting adults, why can't they form a family? Right? And so we have to put it in terms of that larger framework. And so we've got to go back to that question of origin. Our answer to family starts with that question of origin, that God is the one who makes us. Right? And we go right back to Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, what do we find? We find, number 1, that God creates, Genesis 1:1. He creates, but not only does he creates human beings in particular. He creates humanity, and he not only creates humanity, but he creates humanity in his image. Not only does he make them in his image, but he then makes them male and female. And at the end of that, what does he say? It's good. And that's where we start as Christians when we think about family. Now, how do we know what God says on this? Well, obviously, my appeal to Scripture would be one. We know what God says based on his word, but we also can look into God's world and we discover knowledge about him. We discover knowledge about the nature of reality. We discover knowledge about the nature of family. And so that's what we want to do tonight. We want to appeal to both revelations. Not only to Scripture, but as Christians, what we're going to have to learn how to do in a increasingly secular culture is we're going to have to learn how to appeal to the nature of reality, to God's world, in order to advance our arguments. And we have a couple of great guests here that are going to help us with that as well. So before I bring John up, I just want to make sure that we understand what's at stake. And I think a lot of Christians do now. I think what we've seen in the last few years of the culture has begun to wake a lot of those of us in the church. It has begun to wake us up, right? And one thing that John and I write in the Practical Guide to Culture is this idea, right, that ideas have consequences, but there's a flip side to that. The ideas that we hold have consequences, but the bad ideas, the false ideas that we hold also have victims. And this is why we need to get family and marriage and parenting and children right. Because if we don't, we are going to see an increasing brokenness and harm in the culture. And so with that, I want to invite up my friend John to talk to us about particularly marriage. John?
Thanks, Brett. Brett's absolutely right when we talk about marriage, to pull it back to a worldview issue. I oftentimes refer people to that article that Brett started with from my friend Rod Dreher, that article, Sex After Christianity. And I'm with Brett. I think you should go find that and read that. Now, obviously, with a title like that, you need to Google carefully. But Sex After Christianity, because the fundamental point here is that the biggest shifts that we have seen in our culture over the last several decades have not been moral shifts. It's not that there haven't been moral shifts. Of course there have been moral shifts. In other words, things that were once considered wrong are now considered right, and things that were once considered right are now considered wrong. What Dreher is arguing there is that the moral shifts that we have seen over the last several decades, where we've changed our minds even on fundamental things about what is right and what is wrong, that has not been the root, that's been the fruit. There's been a deeper shift that's created the moral shift, the cosmological shift that Rod Dreher puts out. And I would even specify it a little bit. The cosmological shift has taken the form primarily of, ready, an anthropological shift. Now, I know that's a whole lot of big words in a short amount of time for a Thursday night when March Madness is on. And I do want to publicly thank Brett for holding this event during the tournament. But what I mean by an anthropological shift is that our culture has fundamentally changed its mind on what it means to be human. Who are we as human beings? What does it mean, not just as male or female, but what gives us value, what gives us dignity? And this is expressed in marriage. And I think that the fundamental thing that we have seen with marriage, the worldview shift that we've seen in marriage, is that we tend to think about marriage as a speed limit, not like gravity. We tend to think about marriage as if it's a speed limit, not gravity. Let me tell you what I mean. A speed limit is something that people come up with in order to govern the traffic on a particular road. And if things change, for example, we have cars with better braking technology, or we add another lane to the road, or maybe there's a school that's put there on the side of the road, then we can change the speed limit in order to accommodate what it is that has changed. In other words, speed limits are social constructs. They don't exist in reality. They're things that we come up with in order to help us live together. Does that make sense? And that's really what we've done with marriage. We've taken something like marriage and we said, you know what? Let's decide that marriage isn't permanent and that people can enter it when they want and also leave when they want. And let's expand marriage, not only so that it includes a man and a woman, but that it includes two men or two women. And of course, now the argument is going even further to say, let's expand it because look, if it's not connected, for example, to one man and one woman because of their ability to have children, well, then it doesn't matter how many. And so now we have initiatives to change marriage from being just about couples to also being extended to more than just two people. This is called polyamory. This is the next inevitable thing on the slippery slope, I think. If two people can love each other and love makes a family, as the slogan was thrown out earlier, then why can't three people or four people? Why does it have to be a couple? Why not a thruple or a quadruple or a quintuple? Why can't we all get together? And let's also change marriage in all kinds of other ways. I know, let's come up with something else that's a whole lot like marriage, and let's just call it marriage even if it's not. And so that's been one of the features over the last several decades, not only same-sex marriage and no-fault divorce, but also cohabitation. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is fewer people are getting divorced than ever. The bad news is fewer people are getting married up front. Because in other words, we look at something like cohabitation, and you hear people say things. Talk about slogans. This is one of those slogans that you hear, right? It doesn't matter if two people get married. All that matters is that they live together and fill in the blank. Love each other. It's like you've heard this before. Okay, so in other words, this is what we've done with marriage. Things have changed. We're a different people. We have different understandings of this or that or the other. So let's tweak marriage around the edges to make it work for us. We've treated marriage as if it's a speed limit. Does that make sense? You can't do that to gravity. Gravity is not a social construct. You can't decide one day that, as a culture, we have decided that when you jump off the roof, we are going to go up instead of down. And we're going to pass laws this way. In other words, it doesn't matter if you try to socially construct gravity, gravity always wins. And this is really the fundamental question, that's the fundamental worldview question that is at the heart of how we're thinking about marriage. Is marriage a speed limit or is marriage gravity? Is marriage a social construct, something that we've come up with together in order to order our lives together, or is marriage gravity? That no matter what we call it, no matter what we try to do to it, no matter what we try to do to change it, it is what it is, right? There's a line from the late Dallas Willard. He said, you can't step off the roof and then choose not to hit the ground. That's the way gravity is. Now, I think there is a strong case to be made that marriage is like gravity, not like a speed limit. Now, obviously, we can make that case from Scripture, and I'm going to get there in just a second. But here's the thing about the Bible. When we say the Bible is true, what we don't mean is that the Bible is true for me but not for you. What we mean is that whether you believe it or not, the Bible is what? True. It's just true. It's the best account of reality that actually exists. So if the Bible teaches that marriage is like gravity, built into the fabric of the universe by God at creation, which I'm going to come back to here in just a second, then shouldn't we be able to find evidence of that in the world around us? Does that make sense? So before we go to Scripture, let me just say this. I think there's more than two, but let me give you two really compelling reasons why marriage is more like gravity than it is like a speed limit. Does that make sense? You see where I'm going here? Okay, here's the first reason. The first reason or the first compelling argument, I think, that suggests that marriage is more like a gravity than like a speed limit is, you can look back through history and you can find the first culture or the first society or the first civilization that came up with written law, that decided that the law that was going to govern the people isn't going to be just the kind of the command of the king or the emperor or the czar or the ruler, but that actually we're going to write this down. You can find which society gave us written law. You can find out which society, invented the idea of kind of a court of law, like an adjudication so that people can get justice. You can go back and you can find which culture gave us the first written language. You can find which culture gave us the first a whole lot of things. But sociologists and anthropologists have looked back in history and they've tried to figure out which society first came up with marriage. Which society first came up with this idea that a man and a woman could set themselves off as an independent unit and then be responsible for the children under them, and that this would actually be a way that we order our lives together. And you know what? They can't find which society came up with it. You see marriage across human history. You see it in Christian cultures, religious cultures, cultures that kind of came out of the Jewish tradition. You see marriage in pagan cultures. You see marriage across the board. In other words, it's almost like it's always been there. Maybe because it has always been there. You can't find which society gave us marriage. And I think there's three fundamental realities that make sense of why we can't figure out which society gave us marriage for the first time. Three fundamental things. Ready? Here we go. Number one, sex makes babies. I know that's really deep. Do you need some time to write that down? Okay, sex makes babies. Number two, society needs babies. Why does society need babies? Well, I've got bad news. The mortality rate is 100%. Everybody dies. So if you're going to have a future as a society, you need what? You need babies. And number three, babies need a mom and a dad. Now, that's something that has largely been taken for granted throughout every civilization, Christian and non-Christian, until now. And that's where Katie's going to go next, about this idea suddenly that we're questioning that whether babies need a mom and a dad. But no matter if you're religious or non-religious, no matter if you're an ancient culture or a modern-day culture, no matter if you have the internet or don't have the internet, those three things are still true. And because those three things are still true about the human experience, guess what? In every culture, you find some form of marriage. Wasn't fully identical. The only real aberration to kind of the traditional one man, one woman is a polygamist arrangement. That was pretty common in other places. Fascinating. That was always one man and many women, never the reverse, which tells us something. I'm not saying, by the way, that's a good idea. I'm just saying that that's the only sort of alternative arrangement that you find. Does that make sense? Are you guys with me on that? Okay, so the first reason that we have to suggest that marriage is more like a gravity than like a speed limit is that it's in every culture that we can find. The second thing that I think is really compelling is there is a direct correlation between the health of marriage and family and the prosperity of society. Now, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. One way is to kind of get down on the ground and look at the data. And there's remarkable data about this. If you want a website that tracks all this data, there's a data that was born out of the Heritage Foundation called Family Facts. It's familyfacts.org. If there has been a study or a research project done in some sort of correlative relationship between marriage, parenting, and the ongoing relationship that it has to culture, like, for example, which kids are more likely to get in trouble at school, which kids are more likely to be successful in life, all of that sort of correlative stuff, it's at Family Facts. The other way to look at it, though, is not kind of on-the-ground details about like incarceration rates and GDP and things like that, but to get up at the 30,000-foot view. And this was something that a sociologist named Joseph Unwin did back in the 30s. Joseph Unwin looked at 100 different cultures, civilizations that we had record of. And he wanted to know which cultures, what made cultures tick, what could you learn about them. He looked at cultures that would be considered at the time civilized cultures, some cultures he called uncivilized cultures. This was back in the 30s when you were able to say things like that in anthropology. Like, for example, if people ate their neighbors instead of loved them, that sort of stuff. And so he looked at all these civilizations, and here's what he found. It's fascinating. He found that cultures that had a strong control over the sexual appetite through marriage were more productive and prosperous. But cultures in which the sexual appetite was run rampant were less productive and less prosperous. Isn't that a fascinating thing? Here's the thing. Sex is like fire. That's true for individuals, and that's true for societies. When a fire is in the fireplace, it brings light, it brings heat, it brings warmth and ambiance and things like that. When the fire jumps out of the fireplace onto the curtains, now suddenly what was supposed to bring light and life brings what? Darkness and death. Apparently, what Unwin found looking at the history of civilization is that marriage was to sex what the fireplace is to the fire. It's the context that takes this very, very powerful thing and turns it toward good cultural ends rather than destructive ones. So you see that marriage exists across time, across civilizations, across cultures, and every time and place we know of. And there's a direct correlation between marriage and the health of society. In other words, it seems like marriage is baked into reality like gravity. The problem is we have been treating it as if it's a speed limit. The difference between those two things is dramatic. My wife mentioned earlier a guy named T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was just a brilliant writer and thinker on areas of culture and education. And in an article on education once, T.S. Eliot said something really fascinating. And I'm going to paraphrase it because you kind of have to work through the quote. But basically what he said is, whenever you come across something that you don't know about or you've never seen before, two questions come to mind. The first question is, what can this thing do? Or what can I do with this thing? And the second question is, what is it for? And the point of his quote was to ask which of those two questions, what can I do with this, or what is it for, has to be asked first. How would you answer it? Which of those two questions is the most important question to answer first? What can I do with this, or what is it for? Let's say I've never seen a laptop before. Brett, is this your laptop? Okay, good. Let's say I've never seen a laptop before, and I'm like, this is really weird. I wonder what I can do with this. I can open and close it. I could have a puppet show with this. Now, can you have a puppet show with a laptop? Sure. It just would be dramatically underutilizing the laptop. Unless it's a Dell, then it's okay. Or let's say that it's kind of smooth and flat. This is kind of one of those hipster cool MacBook Pros. I bet I could skip this across that lake. Now, can you skip a laptop across the lake? Theoretically, you probably can. But if you do it, not only are you underutilizing the laptop, you're actually going to end up what? Destroying it. So before I know what to do with the laptop, I need to know what is the laptop what? Before I decide to expand marriage, before I decide to prematurely end marriage, before I decide to come up with a substitute and call it marriage, I need to know what marriage is what? For. But if you treat marriage like a speed limit, like a social construct, there's no for in the equation to begin with. Almost everything that we are dealing with on a worldview level in our culture has to do with whether this world is designed and created by God, or whether our beliefs and our views of ourselves and our identity and our social institutions like marriage are constructed. Almost everything flows from that distinction. Does that make sense? There's a brilliant passage here as I close that shows that Jesus thought this same way about marriage. In Matthew chapter 19, a group of Pharisees come to Jesus, and they're trying to trip him up. And they ask him a question about divorce. Moses said we could get divorced. Do you think, Jesus, it's okay for us to get divorced whenever we want to? It's fascinating that he's talking here to teachers of the Jewish law. He's considered to be a teacher of the Jewish law or a rabbi. So you have a legal question from legal scholars to someone else about the Jewish law. Fascinating. Is it okay to do this with marriage, is the question. And when Jesus gets that question in the Jewish context about the Jewish law from rabbis teaching about the Jewish law, Instead of answering from the Jewish law, Jesus says, well, wait a minute, don't you know what was intended by God for marriage from the very what? He takes them back beyond the law to what? Creation. And then he actually goes in and describes the creation. That God created them male and female. And what God has joined together, let no man set apart. And just trust me, this is such a loaded passage. We completely miss what Jesus is doing here. And especially when you go back and look at the context of what's happening when God creates Eve and gives Eve to Adam as his helper. You realize that when God gave Eve to Adam as the helper, it was in the midst of God giving Adam a job to do. Do you remember what the job was that Adam was supposed to do? What was he supposed to do? Name the animals. We often think like these are two stories. In Genesis chapter 2, you can check it out. It's the same story. God's created the world. As Brett says, he looks at everything that he has made and he said, this is good. And then in Genesis 2, before the fall, God looks at what he has made and says, something's not good. What's not good? That man is lonely, so I'm going to make him someone to keep him company? Is that what it says? No. It's not good that man is what? I'm not going to create a companion for him. I'm going to create a what? A helper for him. Why does Adam need help? Why is it not good that he's alone? What did God tell Adam to do? Be what? Fruitful. That's going to be hard. He's going to need some help. And so what does God say? Hey, go name the animals. So you can see this all take place, right? Like there's Mr. Aardvark, Mrs. Aardvark. There's Mr. Giraffe, Mrs. Giraffe. There's Mr. Tapeworm, Mrs. Tapeworm. Like he's naming all the animals. And then what's the conclusion of this whole job? It's so beautiful how this happens. Of all the beasts and creatures of the field, not a single helper was found that was suitable for him. I remember reading that thinking, wait a minute, animals are super helpful. They pull our plow. They give us coats. They give us tasty bacon. Like animals are awesome. He didn't need any help. He needed what kind of help? Suitable help. Guess what? Another Adam would not have been suitable help. Another Eve would not have been suitable help for Eve. When those Pharisees come to Jesus and say, hey, is it okay to divorce for any reason? Jesus said, don't you know what was true from the very beginning? In other words, in order to ask what we should do with marriage, let's look back at what marriage is for. That God created them male and female, and the two shall become one, what? Flesh. That there was actually something in the design of God for male and female. Something in the suitable helper. This isn't just an emotional commitment. Marriage is actually built into the fabric of the world from creation by God to take his image bearers, male and female, and send them on a trajectory to a human future that he himself is directing, eventually will enter himself in the form of Christ Jesus, God the Son, in order to establish the kingdom which will go on forever and ever. Does this make sense? Marriage is not just something that humans made up. Marriage is something that God made up. So we can have ideas about marriage that are different than his, but they're going to have consequences. And the bad ideas about marriage are going to have victims. Does that make sense? Now, I want to bring up Katie Faust here. I'm so excited that you guys get to hear. Nobody is doing more right now to showcase and highlight and bring attention to the most important and most victimized victims of our redefinition of human beings, sexuality, and marriage. And that is children. If you care about children at all, you need to hear this message that Katie Faust is going to bring. So Katie, come on up.
Well, that was great. I'm so inspired. I just wanted to lean back and be like, yes. And when he said, why did Adam need Eve? Why? And I was like, because Adam could not find the sour cream on his own in the refrigerator, right? He needed a woman to be like, honey, back shelf. Well, that's what happens at my house. That's the suitable helping that goes on at our place. I'm really excited to be here, partially because I could use a few more puzzle pieces in my worldview. I tend to be a bit of a reactionary, and I see something that frustrates me or makes me mad or a question that needs to be answered, and then I put all my energy towards it. And so I could really use a little more of a systematic explanation for some of these questions. So I'm really looking forward to soaking in what all of these speakers have to say. Case in point, in terms of being a little bit distracted by things that come up in my life. Yesterday I was on a plane home from Michigan, and I really like my plane time because it's the only time in my life where I'm only doing one thing. All the rest of my life, I'm always doing two things at once. I'm running while I'm responding to emails, right? Or I'm doing soccer carpool while I'm listening to a podcast, for research purposes, right? Or I'm doing the dishes and I'm helping my kid with their homework. So the only time that I ever only do one thing is when I'm on an airplane and there's no pets and there's no kids and there's no other distractions. So I save all of my intense writing projects for the airplane. But yesterday, I got on the plane and I saw this announcement from Dave Rubin. And I like Dave Rubin, right? He has kind of become a darling of the right. He was formerly on the left. He's a gay man, very vocal about his marriage to his partner Dave, Dave and Dave. And I've followed him for a long time. And I know that they had been trying to have a child through surrogacy. In fact, they had made previous attempts that had failed. So like most children created through reproductive technologies, a lot of children are lost in the process before you actually get to a live birth. So yesterday, I sat down on the plane and I saw this announcement of these dual children that they had created. Now, it didn't totally surprise me because Dave isn't a Christian. He's not even a conservative. He just wants the government to get out of his life. But what did surprise me is Prager University congratulating him, and the Blaze TV congratulating him, and Christopher Rufo, who's doing incredible work to expose critical race theory and corrupt sex ed materials in our schools, congratulating him, and Megyn Kelly congratulating him, Candace Owens congratulating him, right? And all of these different prominent conservatives cheering him on. The other response that I saw was revulsion, right? A lot of people going, well, this is sick and twisted. And even some Christians going, he's an abomination, right? This is wickedness. This is child abuse. And then I saw a few people going, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have my mom growing up, right? But the majority of them didn't quite understand exactly what was going on and what the problem was. Not even a lot of the Christians that responded, right? So I'll tell you some of my responses to that, because I spent the entire 4 hours of that flight tweeting. And normally I don't tweet a lot, but it was a tweet fest yesterday, because all of these conservative organizations, right, the places where we're getting most of our news from, in terms of conservatives and Christians, they didn't get this right, because hardly anybody is getting this right. So how do we have a right response to a guy who's a nice guy, who seems to be in a relationship with another nice guy, both of whom would probably be good dads? How do we respond to their pregnancy announcement, right? Well, I think a lot of pro-lifers, in fact, I saw pro-lifers going, Alicia Krause, I think, Daily Wire, yay, babies, right? Well, yeah, we love babies. But that's not what surrogacy is. Surrogacy is on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide. That's what surrogacy is. And yet very few conservatives seem to have that kind of clarity on the topic. You had, people like Dennis Prager, who has produced videos on the 10 Commandments, right? And the goodness of the 10 Commandments, congratulating Dave Rubin on creating 2 intentionally motherless children. How does that intersect with the 10 Commandments that he supposedly loves? Well, the fifth commandment, the first commandment with the promise, is honor your mother and father so you can live long in the land. But that congratulations is actually endorsing a situation where those children will never be able to obey that commandment, right? So they don't even have that right. Even Dave Rubin himself, who came over to our side of the aisle because he supposedly loves liberty and God-given rights. Maybe he understands, maybe he doesn't, but no other conservative seems to be calling out the fact that these babies are losing 3 of their fundamental rights. The first one is their right to life. Only 93% of babies created through IVF, right, which these 2 babies are, 93% of those babies will not be born alive. In reproductive technologies, unborn babies, embryos, are treated like designer disposable products. Only 7% of them will make it through the gauntlet to get to the point where they can be implanted. And then, if they're one of the lucky few that doesn't miscarry or experience incredible preterm birth or all of the other very high-risk factors that go along with surrogacy, 7% of them will be alive. And I hope that that's the case for these 2 children that are now currently being commissioned by Dave and his partner. So first of all, surrogacy, this arrangement that he set up, violates children's right to life. Second, it violates children's fundamental right to be known and loved by the 2 people responsible for their existence, their mother and their father. And tomorrow, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that. What are children's rights? What is this specific right to their own mother and father? What does that have to do with the marriage and family discussion? How does it implicate all of these different questions that we have around marriage and family? But these children, right, their right to their mother is being violated. In fact, surrogacy violates the rights that children have to 3 mothers. That's what surrogacy does. Surrogacy splices what should be 1 woman, mother, into 3 purchasable and optional women in a child's life. The genetic mother, which I was just listening to Dave Rubin's explanation about this, you can purchase from a catalog. Right now, grab your phone, you can look up egg donor catalog, and you can look at catalogs of mothers for your future child. And he described it as, it's kind of like a dating app, right? You figure out, well, this one's pretty, well, this one has the degree, well, she lives close to me, well, I seem to like her better. And that's exactly what it is, right? You're shopping for your child's genetic mother. Second, you have to rent the womb of another woman, the birth mother, right? This is the most expensive part of the process. It's very easy to get sperm. In fact, Dave acknowledged that they had more than enough sperm to make this process happen. But they had no eggs, so they had to purchase 18 from a woman that he said was very young and healthy, because young women have lots of eggs, but they don't. Women all have a fixed number of eggs through their life. So what he's saying is, I'm going to take 18 months of your future fertility and extract them and purchase them from you right now so that I can have them. Women don't have limitless eggs. We have a finite number of eggs. And they made a transaction to purchase several of those eggs from this woman. He acknowledged that the 2 babies, who were both sired by the different guys, both had the same biological mother, because they said, well, we thought that was important. We thought it was important that they would have the same biological mom. Why? Why do you think that's important? Do you think that that's going to matter to the kids, to have the same mom? You're probably right, it will. And they said they both wanted to be the biological father of one of the children. Why? Why does that matter to you? Seems like it mattered enough for you to create 2 different sets of embryos so that each of you could have a genetic connection. And that's often how this goes. Reproductive technologies are the adults going, well, this is what is going to make me happy. This is what's going to fulfill me. right? But nobody looks at it from the other side of the perspective. Well, you want a genetic connection to your child because there's something special about that, but you expect the kid to be okay never having a genetic connection with their mother? And the third way that these children's rights are being violated is they are being bought and sold. Children have a right to be born free. But reproductive technologies, especially surrogacy and third-party reproduction, violates that right. 50% of children who were created through sperm donation said that they were burdened and bothered by the fact that money changed hands during their conception. They feel like a product. Why? Because they are a product. And yet, even though these fundamental rights, the right to life, the right to a mother and father, the right to be born free and not bought and sold, fundamental, God-given, really self-evident rights, for some reason, nobody brought any of that up. It was either total congratulations or expressions of revulsion. So that's a problem, because neither of these responses serve the child. They don't, right? This validation of adult desire that costs children these three fundamental rights, that doesn't help the kid. And this expression of revulsion, it simply serves to say, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for the adults that you're having that response, right? It further reinforces this idea that the adults are the victims in this scenario, but they're not. Children are the victims. So we're going to spend some time tomorrow talking about the state of the family. We are going to go through, I'm going to go through kind of all the different ways that children's rights are being violated in our society today when it comes to marriage and family. But I'll give you a summary here. The state of the family in America, 2022, is the expectations that kids sacrifice for adults. In pretty much every area of marriage and family, whether it's just our conception of marriage, the definition of marriage, whether it is our laws around divorce, whether it's the promotion of same-sex parenting and very, very soon polygamy, right? We already have one city in Massachusetts, Somerville, that legalized polygamous relationships in 2020, because John's exactly right. Like, all the same arguments that you can use to legalize same-sex marriage absolutely work for polygamy. So that's on the horizon. Third-party reproduction, sperm donation, egg donation, surrogacy, cohabitation, transgender parents, all of it. What is the state of the family there? It is expecting the child to sacrifice so the adults can live as they please. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that tomorrow. And we're also going to talk about that tomorrow from the perspective of natural law. So I'm a Christian. My pastor husband, I keep him around for the eye candy factor. He's in the back. He came with me today. We love Scripture. I carry my Bible around with me everywhere. I am like a card-carrying Bible thumper. But if we are going to be effective, we are going to make this case about marriage and family to our unbelieving friends in the realm of public policy and largely on social media, not from the perspective of God-made marriage, but you will harm kids if you don't defend this definition of marriage. So we're going to spend some time talking about that tomorrow. But in summary, I'll tell you that what is the state of the family today? It is one where kids sacrifice so adults can live as they please. And for Christians, that is a big problem. Because if you guys are familiar with your Bibles, you've probably read through the Old Testament, and you've seen that there tends to be 4 demographics that God sets apart for specific care and protection. And they are the poor, the alien, the widow, and the fatherless, right? There's something about those 4 demographics that deserve special attention and protection, that actually have a disproportionate number of laws in terms of making sure that they are not victimized that they're cared for, that special provisions are made for them. And so we know, if you're biblical, we understand that we have an obligation to protect the fatherless, right? In fact, James tells us that pure and undefiled religion before God is to care for orphans and widows in their distress. We have a mandate. Like, if we are not doing this thing, we actually have to question, do we really know Jesus? Do we really know Jesus if we are not caring for the most vulnerable? And yet, what I see is this tendency among Christians, and sometimes even entire denominations, that are compromising on the question of marriage and sexuality, right? They are bending God's truth on the topic of marriage. So that's a problem, because the way that kids were protected in the Old Testament, and we're going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow too, is God was very, very careful to set up biological laws and also moral laws to ensure that children did not become fatherless. First, except by tragedy, first, he required a man and woman to be involved in the baby-making process, right? So no kid could come into this world unless there was a father involved. Second, he set up moral laws to insist that baby-making would only happen within the context of a lifelong commitment between that man and woman. So God did everything that he could to ensure that kids were not fatherless. Sin entered the world, of course, and some kids lost their father and mother to tragedy. That is not the main reason why kids are fatherless and motherless today. Today, kids are fatherless and motherless because adult desires are being prioritized above their rights. And churches that compromise on the topic of marriage and family are aiding and abetting that process. So Christians need to get this right. I understand, I promise I understand how uncomfortable it is to stand firmly on God's desire for, God's command for proper sexual relationships and marriage. I understand that because I've lived it, it'll get you kicked out of Facebook mom groups. It'll heighten tensions within your family. You'll lose friends over it. But the alternative is kids are going to suffer because you don't have the courage to speak up. If we don't get this right, if the nations disciple the church instead of the church discipling the nations, really what you're saying is, it's okay that kids are being victimized. I need the social approval. I actually think that Christians who are standing on a biblical perspective, through a biblical lens, looking at this through a biblical lens, are really the last hope that kids have for two main reasons. Number one, we actually have the worldview that supports the importance of mother, father, and marriage. And we're going to hear a lot more about that this weekend. A lot of different worldview puzzle pieces being put together in our life. But the second reason why I think Christians are really one of the only hopes that kids have is we get our approval from something outside of the world. And that's not really something that anybody else can say, right? I was just cracked my Bible open before I came up here. It opened to Isaiah. There was 2 or 3 different places that just dropped off the page to me and said, fear not, fear not. Why? Because when you fear God properly, you don't have to fear anything else. But if you don't have God to fear, you will fear everything else. And so what I have found is the few people that were willing to stand up and say, hey, Dave Rubin, I like you. You're probably going to be a great dad. This is absolutely wrong. Kids need a mother. The very few that were willing to do that were people that had a little cross in their Bible, right? The ones that were willing to say, I follow Jesus, right? Maybe they didn't have all the arguments down exactly right, but they weren't going to bend. So that's it, right? God will give us the courage, but what I hope you come away with after this weekend is the content, to be able to stand up and fight well on behalf of the most vulnerable, because if we don't, and if we follow the world into compromise, we are not defending the fatherless, we are endorsing fatherlessness. And that is something that, we will grieve the heart of God. We will grieve the heart of God if we don't get this right. So now I think we are going to have the ladies come up and do some Q&A.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
And
come on up, guys.
Gentlemen.
Okay, again, the number. Do you guys need the number again? Do you have that right there, Aaron? I've got it here. Hold on.
I don't have it.
Okay, because that brought up a lot of questions for our online listeners, and I know for me as well. I have a whole page, so you better type in your questions, or else it's just me and Aaron. Okay, the number is 626-869-8525. Okay?
Okay. So we are going to take some of the questions that have been coming in. John, I'm going to hit this one to you first. And thank you, all of you, for the talks. It gets me excited about the weekend. I hope it gets you guys excited, too. Okay, so John, you say that a malleable family structure is problematic, but what God considered family seems to be malleable as well. Here's the example. In the genealogy of Jesus, there are some people who seem to not be family in the way you present. How do you understand the larger family of God, and is there any rigidity there?
Nowhere in the Bible is family presented as being different than what the created norm is. When it is presented, and there's something else that's being presented, it's being reported on, because in a fallen context, the family doesn't always look like God's created intent. It doesn't mean that the intent or the created goodness has changed. This is one of the things I think is so critical in the point that Katie was making with Dave Rubin. Adoption is one of the most wonderful things that there can possibly be, because you're taking someone who was subjected to some sort of harm and you're providing another chance. You're providing another context for them to experience love and care and that sort of thing. That's a very different sort of act than actually going through some form of artificial reproductive technology to create the problem that now needs to be solved. In other words, the created goodness, the created structure, the created design of how procreation is to happen, that doesn't change because there are things have gone wrong. And it doesn't justify intentionally breaking that norm and breaking that structure. I'm trying to think through the genealogies and think exactly about what maybe this questioner is referring to without specifics. I mean, obviously there's two different genealogies, and one of the genealogies too, we have 4 women that are mentioned, all of whom are women of have sexual reputation problems, right? From Rahab to Ruth to Mary to, there's somebody else. Who's that? Bathsheba. Yeah, Bathsheba. Yeah, that's right. Because God is working in the midst of a fallen world to bring the Messiah through family structures that were broken, doesn't mean that there is an endorsement of the broken family structures, or that we should then somehow treat marriage as if it's actually not a thing. I'll say one last thing. The chaos that comes throughout the biblical narrative when the norm of marriage is violated. So for example, polygamy is reported on throughout the Old Testament. Anytime that it's reported on, it's a disaster. Like bad things happen, you know. I don't think anybody here would pray to be a patriarch's wife. Like, it didn't go well. There are, and these are the consequences too of trying to stretch or break the design and make it into something else. It doesn't work. So the Bible reports on all these things, but it never endorses any other family structure than what is the created norm. And I'll go back to the last thing, which is when Jesus was asked how to actually think about marriage and how to think about changing marriage in a particular direction, even from the Jewish law, he goes back to that created design. And his conclusion was different than the interpretation of the Jewish law that the teachers of the law had come up with, which is there's a whole lot of room for divorce. He grants that, okay, divorce happens because of the hardness of your heart, but what God has put together, let no man separate. So again, whose design is this? It's God. Who made the decision that these people come together and that there's a permanence to it? It's God. It's built into the fabric of the universe like gravity. So the Bible reports on a lot of things, but I can't think of anywhere that it endorses any sort of alternative family structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is where, in the Christian worldview, and we often kind of look at the biblical story, the biblical worldview in 4 chapters, right? You have creation in Genesis 1, but not only do you have Genesis 1, then you have Genesis 3. You have the fall. And then kind of as our second chapter, the third chapter is redemption, the fourth chapter is restoration. And so I think taking this and the biblical story makes sense of this. It makes sense of the idea that Genesis 1, there is a design, an objectively good design for family. One man, one woman, becoming one for one lifetime. That's the design. Of course, Genesis 3 comes around, and we have a fall that explains and makes sense of what we see all around us. We see all this brokenness. And to admit the brokenness isn't somehow to devalue, an adoption, but it is to admit and to acknowledge the nature of reality, that that's not the original design. Now, and this is where then you get into chapter 3. Well, that's not the end of the story, right? The fall. No, then you've got this beautiful chapter 3 of redemption. And God is, he's redeeming all of this brokenness. He's reconciling, of course, broken men and women back to himself. And all of us are in that part of the story right now. And I mean, I just think about, your story and my story, Aaron, right? And, Aaron's story of being a single mom. And to admit that that's not God's original intention isn't to devalue you or our daughter Lexi or anything like that, but it is to recognize the nature of reality. And if you don't recognize that, because it almost seems like we don't want to, in an effort to preserve people's feelings and not get them, upset, we won't say these kinds of things. But we need to, because that actually will help us to acknowledge that, okay, this isn't God's original intention, so there's going to be some unique challenges that we're going to face as a family that another family might not face. And what Genesis 3 tells us, that even when you do follow God's original design, hey, there's still brokenness in that situation too, as we can all attest to.
Not in my family. I don't know what's happening.
I've been around your family, and I can attest to the huge amounts of brokenness.
To the brokenness.
Okay, this next question goes off of that, and we'll start with you, Katie. Why do Christians, this is from Maggie, so thanks, Maggie. Why do you think Christians have been so open to IVF, in vitro fertilization, and surrogacy? And then she goes on to say, how can the church better address and talk about this and to deter Christians from embracing it without making those who were created through these means feel marginalized?
Yeah, so good. I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that we love babies, right? Like, why is it that there's some moral confusion about IVF and donor conception and surrogacy? It's because we love babies. Like, do you love babies? Raise your hand. I love babies, right? And we have been fighting for children. You guys may not necessarily think a lot about or understand children's right to their mother and father. My guess is all of you understand that children have a right to life because you've been fighting for it for a long time, right? Probably longer than I've been on this culture war path. And so when we think about that, we think anything that leads to babies must be good, right? And so we do need, what became very, very clear to me yesterday, even watching conservatives congratulate these 2 men who were creating surrogate-born babies, is we need an education, right? All of us need to better understand this. And honestly, don't want to sound hyperbolic, but this just might be the greatest battle of our time, right? We are right back. This is back to the Civil War era of buying and selling people, swapping and trading. And we need to get this right now because artificial wombs are on the horizon. And I've even seen pro-lifers say, oh, wonderful, artificial wombs. That means that if somebody doesn't want their baby, we can just put them in an artificial womb so that they won't abort them. No. Artificial wombs means you get to cut out the most expensive part of the baby-making conveyor belt of sperm, egg, womb. And what artificial wombs means is mass-produced factories of babies. Okay, so we have to get this right now, while we're only dealing with IVF, donor conception, and surrogacy. And here's the good news. When I talk to people about this, when they understand the cost to children, when they see that it harms their right to life, when they hear the stories of children who were intentionally and commercially separated from their mother or father at birth, when we talk about the importance of the maternal bond and the continuation of that to a child's, the importance of that to their future health of trust and attachment, and why we should never intentionally inflict that loss on a child because adult desires are overriding those children's rights. Christians get it. The thing is, we're just not talking about it. When we do, when they understand, when they can hear the stories, when they can look at the studies, and then when they see, oh my gosh, this totally lines up with God's virtuous commands for sex and marriage, they're with us. They're with us. The problem is we're just not giving it very little to no attention. Thankfully, there are some organizations that are talking about it. Colson Center is one of them. So if you're not listening to their podcasts, subscribe. But there's not enough, right? There's not enough. These major conservative organizations obviously don't get it. So I'm not surprised that a lot of Christians are lost as well.
Yeah. If I could add to that, when the Obergefell decision came down from the Supreme Court, this happened at the tail end of a dramatic marriage movement in the church. If you go back to Focus on the Family, you go back to marriage seminars, and we were at an all-time high in talking about how to do marriage in the years leading up to the Supreme Court fundamentally in law changing the definition of marriage. So what happened? What happened was all of these seminars and all of this emphasis on marriage had to do with, here's how you do marriage. What was happening at the same time is in our culture, the definition of what marriage is and what marriage is for was fundamentally being changed in dramatic ways. And same-sex marriage wasn't the first one to do that. No-fault divorce turned marriage into an institution not about children's rights, but about adult happiness. And what we said, that was the first version of that myth that we now repeat over and over at each new stage of the sexual revolution, which is, oh, the kids will be fine. Like, we'll change this and the kids will be fine. We'll change that and the kids will be fine. So what's missing in how we're talking about marriage and how we're talking about childbearing and life is what this stuff is for. We talk about ethics as if it's just about here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And the culture has fundamentally changed our understanding of what those things are. Think about what happens when you go in for premarital counseling, if some of you remember this. What tends to happen in premarital counseling, I'm talking about at your church with your pastor, it tends to be something like, now, do you guys agree on whether you're supposed to have kids or whether you want kids or not? What have you just done? You've taken kids and asked the entire question about the future of your marriage in terms of adult happiness. What premarital counseling even fundamentally asks the question, what are kids for? What's marriage for? What's the relationship between those things? And oh, by the way, you're going to face ethical challenges like in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. Are you clear on what this stuff is? The church has not talked about this, and it's also not talked about the purpose. Now, a great way to see this is if you can compare what's happening in the evangelical church when what's happened with Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics have had a robust theological set of work done on sexuality and marriage with Pope John Paul's theology of the body. So there is this rich resource there where they have actually really wrestled and gone back to the creation story and what God intended. What's missing was translating that to the average everyday Catholic in the pew. So, but there at least was that theology. I think what, by and large, and I'm stereotyping here a little bit, but with evangelicals, what we've done is we talk about right and wrong and ethics and that sort of stuff. But when it comes to sex and marriage and procreation, we haven't done that hard theological work to really wrestle with what is marriage for? What are children for? What is procreation for? So that we can actually ground the ethical things. And when you don't start there, then every new issue becomes kind of like a brand new piece of the puzzle that we got to fit into the big puzzle. And we haven't done the edges as churches. That's what I'm trying to say. We haven't done the edges, particularly when it comes to the human body and what it means to be made in God's image, male and female. And so it's like we're playing cultural whack-a-mole, and we can't keep up. Like, you know, a new artificial reproductive technology pops up every 3 days, you know? And then it's like, it goes from experimental to available, and the journey from experimental to available takes a long time. The journey from available to normal, that takes no time at all. And we're just not ready for it.
Can I give everyone some homework? Just along, you know, kind of piggybacking off what John and Katie have said here. Go to your church this Sunday, okay? Go to your church this Sunday and do your own survey and ask the question, these two questions that John has asked. Just ask the adults and ask the youth, what is marriage and what is it for? And just keep track of the answers that you get. And I think you'll be surprised when you get answers that don't appeal to the personal satisfaction of adults or personal desire, kind of the satisfaction of my own personal desires. If you hear anyone talk about it differently in that, then ask them some questions where they get their view from. But mostly you're going to hear appeals to our own personal desires. And I think what that should help tell us, because that's going to be the majority of the answers, and what that should help tell us is that we're in a lot more trouble than we think. I think we're in a lot worse shape than we actually realize in the church in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my assumption is that a lot of our listeners are going, oh, I have not thought about it from this framework before, which also leads to the next assumption that a lot of our listeners may have gone through with in vitro fertilization or supported this way of thinking about adult happiness. How do we encourage the next step, like towards repentance, or what do we tell our listeners who are kind of like, ah?
Well, I think with some of these things, we need to, number one, help Christians think clearly, think worldviewishly about these things, and then recognize that there are some good, healthy debates amongst Christians. And so, you know, with like something like in vitro, right? You do have Christians on different sides of this issue. And there are particular, you know, and so one of the questions might be, what are the particular aspects of in vitro that are problematic? Why is it problematic? And because we wouldn't say that in principle, medical or some kind of scientific or medical assistance in something like that would be wrong in and of itself. So what we need to do is think more carefully about these things, number one. And help Christians to begin to reason properly, starting with, you know, with our biblical worldview. So if you have a medical technology that somehow harms the integrity of a family, somehow separates children from their parents, then that's going to be a principle that's going to help us weigh these kinds of things. And so, and that's where we need to be careful thinkers. This is where we need to make careful distinctions. Because would we say that in all cases, let's say for something like sperm donation, in all cases is sperm donation out of bounds for the Christian? Well, there's different kinds of sperm donation. There's a situation where you have a husband, you know, and a wife. And so there's not actually a separation of the biology there in that situation. Would we rule that out? Or is it in the situations when you're bringing in a third party? And so this is just some things I think that illustrate we need to think well. And unfortunately, I think the church, let's just admit that the church is so anti-intellectual in the U.S. And we have mistaken notions of faith that actually harm our thinking about the faith. And therefore, we don't produce in our churches thoughtful answers to these most difficult questions. And when you look at kind of experts in different fields, where are all the kind of the evangelical Christians, right? There's not a whole lot out there because we haven't fostered that. And so we really need kind of a evangelical cultural revolution, even within our own churches, I think, to be equipped to navigate this stuff.
What I would say to that question is I've certainly had topics that I've learned about it, and I'm like, wait a second, this isn't the right thing, and had to repent. One of them was when I was on birth control, my husband actually was taking an ethics class, finally, a chance to think well, and he came home and he said, Katie, I'm learning about all these different forms of birth control, and I don't think you should be on anything. And he kind of talked through, like, that was the first time I'd even thought about hormonal birth control, which is crazy because I was like 24. And that was our first encounter with something we had never thought of before. And I think that we made some mistakes. And I know we made some mistakes in our thought process and in our methodology when it came to our approach to children. And so we stopped and we repented. And then we moved forward with the new information that we had. So welcome to the Christian life. I think we've all been there in terms of, and you know what? This is new. This is something that is kind of breaking into the world in new ways. And so it is being forced in front of you for the first time. So if this is your first encounter with it, welcome. And with your biblical worldview and with the courage that I know God is going to give you, the reality is whatever you've struggled with in the past or dealt with in the past, the most incredible thing about this Christian life is all of the things that are our biggest struggles, our biggest suffering, our greatest weaknesses, our greatest failures, right? Those are the things that Satan tries to decapitate us with, right? He will cripple us with those things. But the incredible thing is if we take those and we put it at the foot of the cross, God gives it back to us in the form of a weapon that the darkness cannot overcome. So whatever it is that you've gone through personally, maybe you haven't made the right decision, maybe you have suffered uniquely in some of these ways, don't let it debilitate you. Hand it to God. Let him give it back to you in the form of something that will fight for everything that he loves and the most precious, the most vulnerable. I know that God will use that in some way to defend the most vulnerable.
Okay, so we do need to wrap up, but on that note of further thinking and learning, I do want to, for the people in the audience, we have 2 really good resources, and if you're listening on the live stream, look these up, but John and Brett's book, A Practical Guide to Culture.
Or is it Brett and John's?
Or maybe it's Brett and John's book. It depends who you talk to, really. And then we also have Katie's book, Them Before Us, and she gave you a taste of these topics that really we need to think through as Christians, and her book is a wonderful resource on these topics. But before we end it and let you guys go, all 3 of you are leading ministries, nonprofits that are making an impact in culture. So if people have never heard of your nonprofit before, your ministry, just a quick explanation of what you're doing and how they can go to you and find more resources. So Katie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think that what we're doing at Them Before Us, well, the name is Them Before Us, them the children, before us the adults. Because right now in culture, we are doing us before them, right? It's the adults who get what they want, when they want it, the way they want it, and kids will just deal with whatever is left over, okay? So we flip that. We say, no, children have a right to their mother and father. adult desire needs to conform to that right. And so that right makes demands of all adults, single, married, gay, and straight. It addresses every marriage and family issue, from the definition of parenthood to whether or not gay couples can adopt, and what is adoption, and what is adoption for, and who is adoption for, to all of these things we've talked about tonight, reproductive technologies, why marriage is a social justice issue for children, proper understanding of divorce. So the bottom line is, like, we will trigger you somehow. Like, that's just it. Like, every topic that we have is something that could get you canceled if you were to bring that up in your classroom or boardroom. But we want to make you experts on it. That's one reason we wrote the book, is we distilled all of the best studies on all these different topics so that you know more than anyone else. But also, one thing that our nonprofit does is we catalog the stories of children who grew up in modern families, so you could understand how that loss impacted them in a physical, emotional, academic, and relational sense, often throughout their entire life. So we want to show you the kids that should be the object of your courage, right? For whom you should speak up. So that's what we're doing. And one of the best ways to get involved, I think, is read the book and become an expert, because there really is nobody else that's going to do this for you. It's really just ordinary people who are willing to understand and do what PragerU is not doing, and what Blaze TV is not doing, and what some of our biggest conservative pundits are doing. It's really just going to be you that's able to do it.
Where online can they find you?
Thembeforeus.com.
Okay. Yeah, Maven. Aaron and I started Maven about, a little over 4 years ago now. So we still feel like we're this toddler kind of walking around, but and sometimes we fall down. But our mission, the word Maven refers to someone who's knowledgeable in a certain field and then seeks to pass that on to others. And that's what we want to do for the sake of the next generation. We are passionate about the next generation, discipling our kids and our teens to really know what they believe, why they believe it, and why it matters. And that really, for us, communicates the whole Christian worldview. It's not only knowing how the Christian worldview accounts for every aspect of reality, but then it's living it out. Ideas have consequences. And because we are passionate about the next generation, we are also passionate about those who are discipling the next generation. So parents, grandparents, youth workers, pastors, educators, homeschoolers. We need more allies in this battle, in particular because of where the culture's at. We just need to be allies in the church. And so we're trying to equip those individuals to help disciple their kids well. And that's why we started the Maven conference 4 years ago, was to go after that group and help equip that group. And you can find us at Maven Truth. MavenTruth.com would be the place to start.
I'm the president of an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. It was one of the organizations founded by the late Chuck Colson, if that name rings a bell. But really, our mission is twofold. We want to help Christians make sense of the most challenging issues of the moment from the solid ground of the big story of Scripture. And that requires two things. Number one is you got to know what's happening in the culture. And number two, you got to know what those eternal, the eternal unchanging story of Scripture is, so that you have that bigger context in which you can make sense of what's happening in the world. So the two examples of that we do a daily commentary called Breakpoint. It's a 4-minute commentary on something happening in the culture, and you can get it through podcasts, you can get it through email, you can hear it on the radio, and then on the complete other side of the spectrum, we have a 1-year deep dive program in Christian worldview called Colson Fellows, and that is about as deep as you can go without going into seminary in the big, beautiful story of Scripture and how that provides the framework for a truly Christian worldview. So you can find us, probably the best place to go to get started is breakpoint.org, breakpoint.org, or you can look up the Breakpoint podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay, and Sarah, you do a podcast.
Yeah, with
the lovely
you.
gal.
I know, such a lovely
Okay, so
gal.
tell us about, you can share with everybody about our podcast in case they
Oh,
haven't.
yeah,
heard.
okay. Yeah, because we were going to tell you guys about it at the beginning, and then we got all flustered, so... We were going to say a lot of things at the beginning. It was going to be great, but sorry. Anyway, so the Colson Center, which John is the president of, we're part of their podcast network, and it's called the Strong Women Podcast. And Erin and I both have daughters, and we were looking at the messages coming at us and at our daughters for what it means to be a strong woman, and we were like, oh gosh, how do we tell our girls, how do we paint a big different picture for our girls? Because, you know, on one side you've got culture saying to be a strong woman is to pursue your own happiness, no matter what the consequences and who the casualties are, like we've been talking about tonight. And that's not strong. I mean, that's actually the weakest choice, because it's easy to walk away from the hard things. Unfortunately, the consequences do follow later, but the immediate thing is easy. But we wanted to say, I mean, Erin and I have so many wise, strong women in our life. And I was talking with my daughters about, like, okay, the difference between the strong message that's coming out of culture, like, you know, pursue your own happiness, versus the older lady who is with her husband every week at church, wheeling him into church. Like, that is strong. That's what we want to cast the vision for. Or the woman who has an autistic child, and that is a daily struggle. But she is there. She's staying in that hard situation or whatever. And what we found is that it looks different in different situations and different vocations and seasons of life, but there's some common threads, and one of the biggest common threads obviously is walking faithfully with Christ. And we have been in a mentoring session for now a year and a half with all these different wise ladies. Katie has been on, and guess what? She's going to be on. We're going to do a live podcast tomorrow from the Maven conference during registration, right? And so you can come hear us talk with Katie some more and ask her some fun questions. But did I cover it all? What am I missing?
Good job. You did well. Thanks. Okay, so this weekend we are talking about how we live in this world, but not of this world. And tonight was a great way to kick that off. So thank you for joining us. Those of you here, thank you for joining us on the live stream. And we will see you all tomorrow night as we kick off the Maven Conference.